gonna have to give us feedback after.
Oh yeah, you're gonna be great.
Thank you. Thank you. Hopefully my kids don't start crying upstairs.
Are we still muting between?
Yes, good idea. Yes, we will do that.
Hey everyone, we're just going to give people a couple of more minutes to log on to Zoom, and then we'll get started. So I think we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Root. I'm a school psychologist, and on behalf of the mental health leadership team for the district, I want to welcome you all tonight to the first of 5 series that we are going to be doing with our partnership with Cartwheel Care. We are really fortunate tonight to have 2 of our Cartwheel Care clinicians who will be presenting mental health in the digital world. And at the end of tonight's presentation, they will be sharing with you a flyer about the upcoming workshops that we have scheduled for our community. And again, this is part of our ongoing partnership with Cartwheel Care. So tonight we are really fortunate, as I said, to have Sarah Nichols and Sydney Denmark here. They are clinicians with Cartwheel Care, and they'll be presenting tonight's webinar. But welcome, and we are very glad you're here. The recording, I will just say, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website later this week or early next week for you to view again or to share with others. So Sydney and Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Susan. We're so excited. So glad to see so many people. Before we get started, I'm just going to show you folks some instructions in case you are using closed captioning. So I'm just going to leave this screen up for a moment. If you would like to enable closed captioning, which is available in a number of languages, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that has a CC and an arrow next to it. You're going to click that arrow and then select your language. If you do not see your language, you can hit more and it's going to give you more language options. Se você quis enablar closed captioning em português, você só precisa clicar no CC embaixo do screen e você vai escolher a idioma. Se você não veja a idioma, você pode clicar mais e escolher a idioma. Okay. So thank you so much again, Susan. My name is Sarah Nichols. I am the Cartwheel Program Director and Clinical Social Worker, former special education teacher, have worked in hospital settings and schools for about 15 years now, most recently at Boston Public Schools. And I will let Sydney introduce herself.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. My name is Sydney Denmark. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I currently am a full-time clinician at Cartwheel. Prior to Cartwheel, I completed a fellowship at Boston Children's, where I worked in their emergency department and their outpatient clinic. I also have some experience working in inpatient settings and school-based setting. And prior to becoming a clinician, I worked in media, so I'm particularly excited to be discussing our topic tonight and just want to thank everyone for joining us. Back to you, Sarah.
Thanks. I'll just say a couple words about Cartwheel. So Cartwheel Care, we are a telebehavioral health organization partnering with Acton, Boxborough school districts, as well as a number of other school districts in Massachusetts to provide clinical care for students in grades K through 12. We've had an amazing experience working with Acton Boxborough and are super excited to kick off this series of webinars for parents and caregivers. So in our webinar this evening, we're going to be exploring some risks, benefits, and of course, some unknowns that go along with screen and technology use for our youth. And then we're going to discuss some strategies for how to manage that technology use at home. And then we're going to have substantial time for question and answers with both Sydney and myself. At any time, if you want to throw something in the chat, please feel free. We do have someone monitoring the chat as we speak, so don't feel like you have to wait until the end. So I'm going to just start by asking, what made you all decide to attend this presentation tonight? I'm just going to pause for 30 seconds. And if you guys want to put some things in the chat, that would be super helpful. So it could be anything from, I had nothing better to do, to I'm really worried about my kid. Any and all responses are perfect. So I'll just wait for a moment. Oh, I see that some people are getting a message that chat is disabled. So I'm going to have someone work on that while we continue, and I apologize. So I'm going to start with some very simple statistics here. And these stats are not meant at all to scare anyone. They're just kind of to give an overview of why we're addressing this topic. So as many of you probably know, during the pandemic, the time teenagers spend in front of screens for activities unrelated to school more than doubled. So from about 3.8 hours to 7.7 hours per day. So significant increase. In 2020, around 80% of 14 to 22-year-olds said that they use social media either daily or almost constantly. So what is the impact of that, and what do we want to do about it? I am going to jump to a short video clip here.
Screen time really bad for us? Okay, first things first. Screen time as a term hours creating a video for YouTube is way different than spending 4 hours watching cat videos. How you feel about and how you process each of those situations won't be the same. So lumping them under screen time doesn't make much sense. If researchers want to figure out what spending so much time on our screens is doing to us, they need to break down a few variables. What's the specific screen activity? Are we passively scrolling and looking at pictures, or are we commenting and posting? How long and how often are we on the screen? Because there's so much to untangle, the research is kind of all over the place. You can find individual studies that support and contradict just about every conclusion linking screen time and health. To quote the director of the National Institutes of Health, the research is quite limited, has not been conclusive, and further studies needed. That's why it's crucial to look over a body of research to identify trends.
One moment, folks. So generally speaking, as you now know, research is very mixed on whether screen time and social media is a positive or negative add to teens' current lives. So the intersection of mental health and screens and social media. As most of you might imagine, anxiety, depression, attention, as well as other things, can all be affected by our engagement with screens and social media. That said, research is mixed. Studies tend to look at correlations, which does not equal causation. So high anxiety can lead to screen use, just as screen use can lead to high anxiety. And we don't actually know which causes which. What came first, the chicken or the egg? One quote says, screen time is moderately associated with worse mental health, increased behavior problems, decreased academic performance, and poorer sleep, but a heightened quality of peer relationships. And that was a study for little kids, 9 and 10-year-olds. As we know, peer relationships at that age are super important. Another study, which was actually a systematic review of a number of longitudinal studies, said that the association between screen time and depression depends on device type and use. So we're going to talk a little bit about screens. For the purposes of this presentation, when I say screens, I mean cell phones, tablets, and computers. I'm not necessarily talking about television, which is a little bit different. Something to really highlight is that active and passive screen use are very different. So we're focused on the quality of use and not the quantity. So how children use devices, not really how much time they spend on them, is the strongest predictor of emotional or social problems. So it's really important to keep in mind that when you guys see your students on these devices for hours on end, sure, that's certainly something to pay close attention to. And at the same time, it really depends on what they're doing. So in terms of passive screen time includes common activities like scrolling, watching TV or videos, playing games, anything that really doesn't require significant thought or attention. Active use, on the other hand, can include learning a new skill like coding, creating a website, music, writing, publishing stories, anything really that requires us to use the creative or logical sides of our brain. So if you're online and you're, working on a project for school, that's of course very different than scrolling through cat videos. Not to say there's not a place in life for cat videos, but it's not really the same thing. Screens can have a lot of different types of effects on us, but we're going to talk for a moment about sleep. As I'm sure most of you know, since most of you probably have children, we all need sleep. We all probably need more than we're currently getting. And it's really important for kids because of their brain development. So blue light, which is the backlight that screens emit, phones, tablets, and computers, can disrupt circadian rhythm. And circadian rhythm is what helps us fall asleep. So when that is disrupted, it's really hard to fall asleep. Same with noises and notifications. I know when I leave my phone by my bed and I forget to turn off text messages, that can wake me up in the middle of the night, which is certainly not helpful. For some teens, adults as well, but specifically teens, even having that device in the bedroom can increase anxiety. So if your teen is waiting for a message from someone and the phone is right next to them, it's probably going to be more difficult for them to sleep than if that phone is either off or not in the room at all. And then just recognizing sleep hygiene is really important. And when I say sleep hygiene, I mean things like mostly routine, and that routine ideally does not include a device. So if kids are looking for a way to wind down at night, things like reading, listening to music, conversation, even television, honestly, can be better than looking at a phone. And we can talk a little bit more than that in a bit, but I'm going to pass it over to Sydney.
Thank you, Sarah. So as social workers, we are always striving to use a strengths-based perspective, which is something maybe not everyone here knows, so I'm happy to explain it. And it's a process that aims to put individuals' strengths as opposed to their challenges at the center of the helping or learning process. And that's what we aim to do with this slide. We'd like to demonstrate that while there are challenges, there's also several strengths and potential positives of using social media. So social media has changed and will continue to change our world. And platforms like Instagram and TikTok and Twitter provide opportunities to build community for kids and for those who have similar interests. And that's a great benefit of social media. Social media can also be a fantastic outlet for creativity. Kids who are creative or artistic in any way, they may use social media as a platform to share their creations, and that can be a really wonderful way to develop self-esteem. I had a student that I worked with a couple years ago who made these stop motion videos, and sharing them on social media offered the student validation to their work as an artist and as a creative person that they might not have had they just been tucked away and isolated on their computer. So another thing that's really positive and important for us to think about is that kids don't always have a lot of choice. And so the opportunity to have some autonomy over one's narrative and presentation of self is something that social media allows young people to have. Kids who are introverted or less likely to engage in typical ways might find it more comforting to engage online and on platforms like social media. So there's several potential positives of utilizing social media. So existing on social media in any capacity invites opportunities to experience the often dreaded, but very necessary feeling of vulnerability. So Brene Brown, who has a PhD in social work, she's a researcher, she says that staying vulnerable is a risk we have to take if we want to experience connection. And that's what we want to teach kids, that it's worth it to experience some vulnerability for the gift of feeling connected. Vulnerability can be triggered by many things. One thing is wanting to belong, taking a chance and hoping to connect. And that is so much of what social media is about. You know, people post in hopes of receiving feedback in the form of likes or comments, or follows, and that stimulates connection. But that connection is different than the connection that we've previously been familiar with. The online world has an added kind of currency, and that is something that we call social currency, which refers to the potential resources of someone's online presence. So for example, President Biden likely holds more social currency than your neighbor Fran. And this is important because this concept trickles down in a micro way as well. Teens may gain popularity or they may gain recognition from their peers for having a following. And this may elicit opportunities for teens to begin to compare themselves. And so that's the piece where engaging becomes a bit more tricky, because we want to think about, does the relationship with social media just feel like an opportunity to compare oneself? Are kids reading and interpreting accurately? And you know, it's important to engage in the vulnerability, but how is social media making kids feel? So what is the cause for concern? I want to come back to what Sarah discussed and what the research says, which is that it's less about how much kids spend on social media and more about what they're doing. and how they're feeling when they're engaging. So we want to be curious about if they're using social media to avoid connection or to shift their feelings. When your kids are stepping away from social media, do you hear that they seem more critical of themselves? Are they critical of their appearances or their strengths or their weaknesses? Are they struggling to focus in school? Are they able to step away from social media in order to take care of themselves, to take care of their personal hygiene or their eating or their sleeping? So this list and what I'm talking about are things that we want to continue to be curious about. And I'm sure that all of you are curious how to support your kids in this. So I'm going to hand it back to Sarah to talk about how to support kids.
Thank you, Sydney. So first, I want to focus on overall wellness and functioning. So as most of us know, we always want to do our best to focus on the whole child and not just the things that we think are going wrong. So some questions to ask yourself might be, is my child physically healthy? Now, that doesn't mean, is my child going to the gym 3 times a week? It means, do they get outside and take a walk? Do they sit on the couch for 4 hours in a row, or do they get up to engage in other activities? Are they playing pickup basketball on a Saturday? That type of thing. Do they have friends? Do they have friends that they talk to in school? Do they hang out with cousins on the weekend? Do they have peers their own age that they enjoy spending time with? It doesn't mean that they have to have 10 best friends. Do they do relatively well in school? Doesn't mean that they're a straight A student. It just means that they're at their baseline functioning. Do they engage with family members at home? So a lot of times we see teenagers want to shut themselves in their room and just be by themselves. That can be very normal behavior. But if it's out of the ordinary for your kid, you know them best. So you're going to be able to tell whether you feel like something's off or not with how they're engaging at home. And then I think we've mentioned this, but do they have interests or hobbies outside of their electronics? It doesn't have to mean that they're involved in some type of organized activity, but do they like to draw? Do they like to play soccer? Do they enjoy something outside of just being on a phone or a device? And just touching on sleep, in the age range that we're talking about, sleeping 8+ hours a night is ideal. I know that not all kids get that, but that's what we're striving for. So we've broken up some recommendations among ages 5 to 11, and then we'll talk about 12 and above. So some recommendations for these younger kiddos are watch things together. If you see that your child is watching a lot of videos on YouTube, maybe you carve out half an hour in the evening and watch them together. And then you have the chance to encourage some type of videos while maybe discouraging others. Set collaborative boundaries around time. So it's really hard to say to a kid, you need to stop using that phone at 8 o'clock. Some kids will be able to do that and some kids won't. Whereas if you have a conversation where you're approaching it as such and allowing them some choice and what the boundaries are, it's more likely that they're going to be on the same page as you. Not always, but potentially more likely. Now, this is a really hard one. Don't use technology as a reward or consequence. I think we have all done this, and it's something that in some ways is normalized, I think, in our communities in general, but it can lead to overvaluing the device. So even a young kid, if they pick up on the fact that, oh, hey, every time I do something wrong, I get my phone taken away, it must mean that my phone is a really important item. We want to try and discourage that by not using it as something that we're pulling back and forth on. Variety and activities we've touched on, but just trying to add in some other things, whether it's going for a walk, doing some type of craft cooking, anything that just takes them off their device for any period of time is always a good thing. This next one is a tough one. Prepare kids to discover inappropriate images. So as many limits as we put on kids' devices, there's probably going to be a point in time in which they get on the internet and find things that are not good for them to see. So really just being able to offer conversation around this type of thing, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily pointing out things like nude images and pornography, but making space for being able to have a conversation if they come across something like this so that they do bring it to you as opposed to hide it from you. Positive sleep hygiene about devices. We typically recommend trying to avoid the blue light on a screen for an hour before bed. I know that can seem like a long time. Another thing you can do, which many of you probably know about already, is you can actually change the light on your device, on your phone or your tablet, or even your computer to go from a backlit blue to a backlit orange. And that actually, the warm light actually helps to avoid the difficulty with circadian rhythms. And then this last point, enable friction such as notifications. So there are apps or programs you can download for your phone, your computer that will remind your child to take a break from their phone. So it'll be like a pop-up that comes onto the screen and just says time for a break. It just reminds them to make sure that they're not continuously using the device. And then these are some recommendations for older kids. Now, obviously, these recommendations can cross age categories. It's more of just a general recommendation. So around ages 12 and above, model healthy behavior. I don't know about you, but this is really difficult in my household because my husband and I use our phone for work and we're on them a lot. So what my husband and I have done is from about 5:30 until 7 p.m., we say something called phones in a cup. And we literally put our phones in a mug on the counter. Now my kids are really young, so they don't actually really know what's happening. It's actually for us that we're doing this because it helps us to set our own limits for each other. And ideally over time that will become modeling a healthy behavior once our kids are old enough to understand why we're doing phones in a cup. This is similar to the last slide, set collective boundaries or collaborative boundaries. So if you have a teenager, that this is probably even more important, being able to have a conversation about what they think is reasonable and what you think is reasonable, and ideally meeting in the middle is ideal. But you know your child best, you know what's going to work for them more than anyone else will. Internet privacy, help them with their settings. They don't always know how to like clear browser history, for example, and things like that will often help with making sure that they don't get into like trouble online, especially when they're not looking for it. Follow, but don't spy. So in my opinion, it's perfectly understandable to follow your child on, for example, Instagram. What we want to try and not do is spy, meaning tap into their login and look at all their messages. Now, obviously, you might have to do that if there's a reason for you to be concerned. But in general, we want to give them some semblance of privacy so that they learn how to develop autonomy on their own. This is probably common sense and yet is still worth saying out loud. Naked pictures are always a bad idea. They don't go away ever. You'd be surprised how many students at the high school level don't actually know that when they send a text, that image is now online. So just having that conversation is important. Sydney touched on this earlier, tone in text. For some kids and even adults, it's hard to read sarcasm through a text message or an email. And it's not just sarcasm, it's just hard to read tone in general. So helping them to understand what someone else is saying can often be the difference between losing a friendship and creating a repair. And again, sleep hygiene, I'm very pro sleep hygiene. trying to avoid that blue light for an hour before bedtime.
So,
And yep, go ahead, Sid.
yeah. So at Cartwheel, we often use this term coined by our medical director to make things talk aboutable. And we know it's not a real word, but it's a word that really helps us to articulate what we want to happen between kids and parents or kids and caregivers. And so we want to make screen time and social media talk aboutable in households. We want to limit language that elicits shame. So instead of you shouldn't, or gosh, you're always on that screen, how can we instead be curious? Ask your child what they're watching. How can you get involved to engage with them? We also think it's really important in making it talk aboutable to validate the joy of using social media. It's really fun to be online, to watch entertaining videos and to look at pictures, and kids shouldn't have to feel shame about that. And so we always want to encourage parents to validate the joy. We also want to acknowledge that social media is really tricky to navigate, even for adults. And because it's tricky to navigate, even for adults, we want to let kids and teens know that there's support from adults. So some additional resources and outlets beyond making it talk aboutable. When in doubt, we always want to encourage caregivers to look to a professional. Teachers and therapists today have a lot of experience with supporting kids, and so those are always great resources. Primary care doctors can be very helpful and can be a great resource to direct your questions to. And we always want to have real talk. Kids value honesty and transparency. And so if you're worried about your child's screen time or their online presence, express that and invite an opportunity to collaborate together, as Sarah mentioned, on ideas of how to engage in ways that feel better for you and for your child.
I am going to, in the interest of time, so I want to make sure we can get to questions. We're going to pause there. And I'm going to stop screen share. So please feel free to add anything into the chat, and I'm taking a look right now. And anyone at Cartwheel, please feel free to flag for us if we're not seeing something. Okay. So I see a question from Kara here. It's either Kara or Kara, I apologize. The reason I'm here is that I just found out my daughter's 5th grade class has access to YouTube. Okay. So I imagine, I wonder if you can, okay. I wonder if you can, Kara, give a little more info on, it sounds like your concern might be that there aren't necessarily limits on what your child can watch, and you're concerned about that. Feel free to add on, but I would say just honestly saying that to your daughter, just saying like, there's a lot of things on YouTube that we don't all like we wouldn't all necessarily encourage us to watch. And being open with her and curious, as Sydney mentioned, to see what it is that she's enjoying watching. And you might be surprised that it might be perfectly appropriate things, or it might not, in which case that might be a chance for you to have a conversation. Another question here. My high schooler is going through depression, and as a parent, I want to understand how to work with our son. I'm sorry to hear that. I might encourage you to talk with your son's school counselor. And if you know who that is, if you don't know who that is, I'm sorry, I'm sure that Susan can point you to the right person. All the school counselors at Acton Boxborough are super knowledgeable. And I'm sure would more than welcome having a conversation or a meeting. And as Cartwheel's mental health partner, it might be a situation where we could potentially help. And we would love to, if that makes the most sense for your child. Oh, what are your thoughts on Snapchat? I have no way to monitor it. Sydney, do you possibly want to take that one?
This is a tricky one, and I want to be thoughtful about how I answer it, but I think I'm going to go back to what we talked about, which is communication with your child, right? If you feel like they're engaging in ways that you want to monitor, it sounds like there's an opportunity to have a conversation there.
Thanks, Sydney. And if you folks have follow-up questions, feel free to add on. I do see that we had an add-on regarding the YouTube question. I see. So worries about open access to YouTube and TikTok. And there are explicit filters, but sounds like you might be worried about just this idea of open access in general. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a valid concern. And I think that my best answer would really just be to sit your child down and tell them, just say, hey, I'm worried about you having access to all of this media. And I wonder if we can talk about what types of things you're interested in viewing and if I might be able to look at some with you. I'm going to jump to another question here. My teen daughter is dealing with depression. How can I help her? Again, I'm sorry. I know depression is tricky because it can encompass so many different behaviors and presentations. I would open up if you haven't already, I'd open up a conversation about it. Just say, hey, I'm noticing that you're isolating yourself more often, or you seem like you're really sad. You may already be having these types of conversations. And I wonder if talking to a professional might be helpful to her. Again, you might already be doing this, but if not, it might be a time to intervene. Happy to consult further if that would be helpful. And again, Susan would be a great resource to point you in the direction of a school counselor for us to start a more in-depth conversation. That goes for anyone.
I see a question about online games with a live chat, and I think it's a really good question. Again, I would talk with your child about what they're putting in that chat, right? We don't want to put information like their address or where they go to school, but connecting online in a forum like that can be really positive for kids. And we discussed, earlier in the presentation, it can simulate connection and make engaging feel more approachable. So I wouldn't discourage it, but I think having a conversation about what in fact your child is sharing would be really important.
And I do see that follow-up worry regarding Snapchat and the fact that the conversations disappear. I totally get that. I think I would feel the same way if there wasn't a way to go back and view something that you might be concerned about. I think it's just naming it. It's just saying like, hey, I know you're having conversations on Snapchat and they might be perfectly appropriate conversations, but since I don't know, I want to have a conversation about it. Like what people are you talking to? Are you talking to people that you know that you've met in person? Or are you talking to people that you've only met online? And if so, what draws you to those people? Like, what is it about these online personalities that you enjoy? Is it the anonymity of it? Like, is it easier to share things with someone that is actually not connected to your day-to-day physical life? And it might really be an opportunity to better understand some anxiety that they may or may not have about engaging in those, like, I don't want to say real life friendships because that implies that the online friendships are not real, and they certainly can be. But as we know, there's also this phenomena called catfishing, where people pretend to be someone they're not. And that's really what you're looking for. So asking questions about like, have you met the person in your physical life? Maybe even asking, do you think I could potentially talk to them? Some kids would be open to that. Sydney, I'm not sure if you saw this one, but regarding the games, yeah, there's like not a predictable end time. They just go and go. Do you want to take that one?
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's some research that says we want kids to finish a game, right? We want them to get to the end and then stop playing, because if you interrupt kids in the middle of a game, it can cause dysregulation, or irritability or anger, that sort of thing. So when your child ends a game, can that be the end point? Am I understanding the question correctly?
I think so. I might also add, as you're saying, like sometime, so you're describing a little bit, like a little teeny bit of what I might call a compulsion, but it's like on a very small scale. And I think based on what you're describing, it's at a point where you can intervene. So I would give multiple warnings, just say things like, hey, you have about half an hour until we probably should think about winding down. How about 15 minutes? Where are you with that game? Do you feel like 15 minutes is a reasonable expectation to wrap it up? And just like lots of warnings and inviting them to say back to you, okay, yeah, fine. I think I can do that. Or mom, I need to just have 2 more minutes and then I'll be done. I think is okay now and then. But yes, at some point there has to be an end point, as Sydney's saying. Oh yeah, he can't stop for dinner. That's hard. I think it might depend a little bit on like what else is going on in his life. So for example, is it just these games that he's getting caught up in versus he can't get off his device at all anytime, and he's not sleeping and he's not eating and he's not doing well in school, those type of things. But I kind of keep going back to this idea of like, name it and name it outside of the time period in which he's actually engaging in the game. So maybe on a Saturday morning when he wakes up, you sit down, maybe you take him out to breakfast and you say like, hey, I'm a little bit worried because of this. Can we figure out a way to problem solve it together? So I am seeing that we are a little bit short on time. And before we end, I did want to show you all this flyer on upcoming presentations that you might be interested in. And I also wanted to give you guys a link to provide us with some feedback if that sounds like something that you could do. And I apologize because I'm having a little trouble navigating to, here we go. So I'm sorry, that took me a little while there. This is a little flyer here on some of our upcoming workshops with Acton Boxborough. So we have one coming up at the very beginning of March 1st. And this is actually going to be done with a presenter that has done some really awesome research on screen-based technology and relationships. Then we have one on ADHD and executive functioning, fostering resilience in our kids and ourselves, and then recognizing and managing anxiety. These will all be available to you through Acton Boxborough, and I'm sure that Susan will be able to point you in the direction of how to register. Before we end, I'm just going to drop this link in the chat regarding a feedback survey, if you folks wouldn't mind doing that for us. And thank you so much. It was really wonderful being with all of you. I'm sorry we didn't have a little bit more time for questions. But we really appreciated you all attending.
Thank you for joining us. And thank you for your questions.